Okay, so Cliff, let's start with the radiation and atomic workers. This has been a passion of yours, a lifetime pursuit, really. Mm-hmm. Why? What about it motivates you?
Okay. What happened was I had a sister named Linda who in 1972 she was at Memphis State University with my other sister Jan, and she came down with flu-like symptoms, and they took her blood count and found it was really high, and so brought her back to Nashville where we grew up. My dad was the news editor of the Tennessean for about 30 years, and so she went to Vanderbilt Hospital where they found she had acute myelogenous leukemia, and she was given about a 99.98% mortality rate for AML at that time, and so she went on this slow climb to death, and then miraculously was entered into a human radiation experiment out in Seattle, where there were 10 people and 10 doctors from around the world, and they were creating something called the human, it was called the bone marrow transplant. So these were the guys who invented, and women, because there were women doctors as well, who invented the bone marrow transplant. So there were 10 patients, 10 doctors. There were more doctors than there were nurses. And anyway, she was there 101 days, and 9 patients died and 1 lived. My sister was the one that lived. And in the course of that, afterwards, my mother was invited to a talk where a radiation biologist found from his own studies that that radiation was one of the only known things to cause leukemia. And about that time, my mother, who's a very successful businesswoman, went through the horror and the how tough it was to see someone go through leukemia, even if they survive. It's just one of the most horrific diseases out there. Walk on around. Welcome. And so this doctor named John Goffman gave a talk. He was part of the Atomic Energy Commission's Radiation Biology Studies program, and he said that there were studies that said that if everyone in America received the allowable dose of radiation from nuclear power plants, there would be 32,000 additional cancer deaths a year, and that included leukemia. And my mother thought no one should go through the horrific trial of leukemia for the sake of flipping on a light switch. So my mom, who's got 2 years of college from LaGrange College, 2 years, took on this company up here in Knoxville called Tennessee Valley Authority. And she and a woman named Dolores Siegenthaler, who was John Siegenthaler's wife, and another woman named Faith Young, these 3 women intervened against TVA on what was going to be the world's largest nuclear power plant, which was 4 units down by 50 miles from Nashville, based in a place called Hartsville, Tennessee. My mom, with 2 years of college and a $50 calculator, read all of the environmental impact statements that TVA put out on that Hartsville nuclear plant, and she found errors. And she found errors, simple errors in their calculation. And based on those errors, they went back and forth in the court with TVA 4 separate times and forced them to redesign a nuclear power plant. And by the time they got around to the 4th redesign, they'd already spent over $1.25 billion, and they were only 10% complete. And so they gave it up. Yeah. And they shut down that plant. Now, I didn't mention that my mother's brother was a mathematician for the NSA. They're really, really smart people. But yeah, they that's what happened. So my mom was immersed in fighting nuclear power. I was a kid growing up around this. I was also 14 years old. My sister had leukemia. And so we had physicists, biologists, mathematicians. We had all these scientists and doctors hanging out in our living room. And I mean, some of the most famous national physicists in the country were coming and hanging out in the house and having these real lively conversations. And so I was just like a kid around this, soaking it up.
Yeah.
And so when I came to UT, second week here, freshman year, I got a job at work study in sociology department, 9th floor, up in McClung Tower, right over there. I
Right
guess.
there. It's still there.
Yeah, and so I was hired because of my nuclear background and worked on surveys on attitudes, public attitude toward nuclear power, and but being here in Knoxville, being a student just like you guys, I was around other kids whose parents, uncles, grandfathers, aunts, all sorts of people, just like you, had worked at Oak Ridge and heard horrific stories of people who worked around secret stuff, and they couldn't tell anybody what they had worked around, and then they would come down with some strange, not very, I mean, it wasn't always cancer, and it wasn't leukemia always. It was different health problems that were unexplained, and they would go to doctors, and the doctors couldn't explain it. They'd go to other doctors, they couldn't explain it. But these people, because they were under National Security Act, they couldn't tell the doctors what they had been exposed to. And so that was, I guess that's how I was sensitized to these issues, that there were ongoing problems within the nuclear power programs. There were ongoing problems within the nuclear weapons development programs, but it was all very quiet.
It was all kind of hushed up.
It was hushed up. But then I found, real quick,
Okay.
if I
Go right ahead.
So the people who have read my Hidden Files, the story of the Hidden Files in the New York Times, they basically know the story about finding the files over in the special collections that detail precisely how the government suppressed the information, and the policies and procedures and protocols that they went about doing that. And that's what I uncovered. That was in graduate school. I initiated congressional investigation and went to Washington, and that's all written up in the New York Times article. I don't need to wax on that one.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And those who are doing the radiation story, I want to open up to your questions. Do you have questions now? Yes. Nick.
I guess, how many people do you think, like today, by your estimation, how many radiation workers are sort of impacted by like these negative side effects and these things?
Well, I know we worked, 1999, we have worked to get nuclear workers to congressional hearings on these health impacts, and out of that work, and it was Senator Fred Thompson credited one of our witnesses who testified to help get the passage of this thing called the Energy Employee Occupational Compensation IA Act, an act passed that would compensate affected nuclear workers injured by the radiation, the heavy metals, the radiation, and the chemicals. And I'm fairly certain that over 10,000 people have been compensated to date, and I'm fairly certain that over 70,000 families, estates have applied for compensation. So if you say 70,000 people have been affected, and that's Manhattan Project workers who built the first two bombs all the way up to the late 1980s. I believe that number carries. But if you say, okay, 70,000 people were affected, that's more people that were killed and more American service people who were killed in Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq combined. And it's kind of ironic that we're doing this on Veterans Day, because these people are, to me, they gave service to the country, and they'll never get a medal. They'll never be acknowledged. There'll never be a wall, a big black wall in Washington, D.C. that will have their name on it. The government did everything it could rather than to acknowledge them, to hide what happened. Anyway.
Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think could be changed today to bring down like the radiation damages to people? What specifically?
To bring down radiation damages to people, boy, a lot, a whole lot. I think the greatest and most immediate threat that we all have to radiation exposure right now are the nuclear weapons in our arsenals, and the escalation of hostilities that are triggering in the Ukraine and the Middle East and North Korea. Our greatest immediate threat is not just exposure to nuclear radiation at low-level doses. It's nuclear war. So that's one that we really need to be focused on. As to the others, independent oversight of all the agencies that regulate workplace exposure in the nuclear power plants and in the nuclear weapons development plants. Independent oversight. University people. They have that in Great Britain. They have independent monitoring, environmental monitoring by universities in Great Britain, and we need that sort of thing here as well.
So the Department of Energy can't be trusted to regulate itself?
No. I mean, you think about Jake Butcher. How good of a job did he do regulating himself in the banking business?
Yeah. For those who don't know, that was a Knoxville banking scandal back around the time of the World's Fair.
1982, yeah.
All right, other questions? Yes.
I was reading your article, and I was getting really interested about the Alan Klein, the kid from University of Chicago, but I got caught behind a paywall.
Can you speak up? I didn't wear my
Sorry,
hearing aids today.
You got copy behind a paywall.
Yeah, I was reading about the Alan Klein in your New York Times article, and I was
Yes.
getting interested in. I was like trying to read through that, and then I got caught behind a paywall. Can you explain?
You got caught by.
a
paywall.
Like I
What's
can't
that
read any further.
I mean,
Oh, well,
unless
then
you
what we need to
subscribe
do,
Times, you don't.
I gave a law professor, business law professor, Eric Aramonte, I didn't give it to him, I loaned it to him, the original copy of that New York Times article.
And you can find, I believe, a PDF that I put in the files area.
Yeah, but I'd say walk over and look at the original and make a copy from that, because it's about this big. It's yeah,
But yeah.
Sunday Magazine's really shrunk now.
I think it's in the files or the pages area. You'll find a folder of his articles.
Yeah.
So,
Samuel Alan Klein. Alan Klein was one of the original physicists working with Oppenheimer and Fermi and Szilard, all these guys to make the bomb. And he was where the other guys were doing the calculations. And I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Oppenheimer. That's a good movie to go watch. Well, so Klein was this young kid physicist, and his job was to take their specs, their designs, and work with the machinists to get those the uranium sphere and the plutonium sphere and the beryllium shell. His job was to make sure that those things were machined within less than 100,000th of an inch from perfection. And he was my classic example of, here's a guy who, when they had the accident, he was able to go work with Phil Morrison, who's a great physicist out of Cambridge. And they were able to sit down and calculate their own exposures based on their knowledge of radiation. He knew precisely all the tests and the things that they would do to calculate how much radiation he'd been exposed to. Unlike 99.99% of all nuclear workers, 99.99% of all weapons workers, these guys knew. They had a known source, they had the event, they knew how to calculate what they were exposed to. And it must have been horrific for this fellow named Louis Slotin, because he was handling it when it happened, and he knew he got a fatal dose. And he knew that within days he would die this awful death. But this man then, after being injured by radiation, went to Yale Law School. He couldn't work around radiation anymore because he'd had a lifetime dose. And so he went to Yale Law School, only being able to read a few minutes at a time before his eyes just started tearing up because of the exposure to radiation, and was able to get a law degree from Yale Law School. Not a slouch law school, Yale. And he tried for years to get the truth of what happened to him. And they lied to him. And not only did they lie to him, the very papers, the very studies, the very findings that they had were in the very file that the head of the Manhattan Project Medical Division kept. So it was as clear a cover-up as you could possibly imagine. And those files were right here at the University of Tennessee.
And you found it.
And I found it. And I was the first one to look at them, ever.
Well, that's a feather in your cap, but also a service. And you've been doing this service most of your life, really. This has become a lifelong effort, really.
My wife and I got kind of hung up in the nonprofit world, and that's where we wound up.
Yeah.
My wife was still working in a project that was started by the University Law School called the Community Mediation Center. And
you did a lot of work with the Helen Ross McNabb Center, right?
No, I worked on the radiation stuff in 1984. We created a nonprofit called the Radiation Research Project, and then became the American Environmental Health Studies Project. And we did that from 1984 until we helped get the bill passed, the EEO,
Right.
CIPA, whatever that bill is called. The Energy Workers' Compensation Act bill passed in 2000. When that got passed, I said mission accomplished, at least for as much as we could get done. And then I was asked to help rescue a birth center here, natural birth center called the East Tennessee Maternity Center, which then became the Lisa Ross Birth and Women's Center, and ran that for a half decade.
All right, very good. So now you got a little bit of background as well. Any other questions from what I call the radiation exposure group? Yes, Dan.
Do you think that in the future there will ever be a time where like nuclear energy or something can be, I guess, researched safely, or do you think it's always going to be like a no-go? It's always going to result in some issues like this?
Well, I have to ask why. I have to ask, now that we have solar energy reaching the efficiency levels that we have, now that we have the ability to have utterly clean energy as opposed to PR created clean energy, to say that nuclear energy is clean is like saying have a nice day after you've been wiped out by a nuclear bomb. It's a lie. It's just a lie. Back when I was working on this 30 years ago, there had been a congressional study that had 5,000 studies had been done on how to store nuclear waste effectively. And over 5,000 studies have been done, and there was still no permanent long-term solution for the storage of nuclear waste. And so until you can have this waste, plutonium has a half-life. Anybody here know what it is? Is it 29,000 years, 39,000 years?
I believe it's closer to 500,000 years, isn't it?
It's, well, the half-life, it means half of it will
Disappear.
will wear out in 29 to 39,000 years, which means it will be around for 500,000 years before it ever is safe. So 500,000 years, we've got to do something where as civilization, we haven't gotten anything right for 2,000 years. So to say that we're flicking on that light switch, you know, for powering up your electric car, you're going to create something that has to be monitored very carefully for 500,000 years. Or not. Or say, screw it. Just screw it. We'll just make it. We'll use it. We'll be done with it. And we'll let future generations deal with the waste issue. One thing I did that I'm very proud of, when I was y'all's age, I was 1978, we started a group here on campus called Volunteers for Clean Energy, which was the first solar energy group here on campus. And we got wind that they wanted to create something in Oak Ridge, TVA again, it's called the Away from Reactor Storage Facility. And basically what they wanted to do was take all the nuclear waste of the highest, the spent fuel rods, these long pin-like things that have the highest nuclear waste. They wanted to store it here in Oak Ridge and call it the Away from Reactor Facility, AFR. And students, we got together in 6 weeks' time in February in 15-degree weather and protested up at TVA's corporate building. At the same time we were doing that, my mother, who had just kicked their ass on the Hartsville nuclear plant, was upstairs in this executive boardroom meeting with S. David Freeman, who was the chairman of TVA board, saying, David, you don't want to do this. You really don't want to do this. We don't want that. And my mother said in 1978, talk about prescient, y'all know that word. She said, if you put all that high-level nuclear waste in one place, it's going to be a magnet for terrorists. So can you imagine now, with all the terrorism that's going on right now, what it would be like to be living 35 miles from all the highest level nuclear waste stored in one place? So I'm patting myself on the back. That's,
Well, you should, and your mom too. And
Yeah.
I want to get into your family because we're going to switch to the other group now because your family has a deep and long connection to sort of news coverage of the civil rights movement.
yes.
Yes. Now, your father, as I understand it, he originally was a reporter in Alabama, am I right?
Okay, so it starts out where he met my mother. Okay, so Georgia and Alabama are real close together. You know that. They're like side by side.
I've heard that, yeah. Okay.
I saw that on the map the other day and it just like stunned. So my dad was originally from Birmingham, Alabama, went to Auburn, wanted to be an aerospace engineer, crapped out in calculus, so fell back into journalism.
Okay.
No, I bet you all know calculus like the back of your hand. But he started out, I think his very first paper was in LaGrange, Georgia, where he met my mom, who was in her first or second year at LaGrange College. And so he went from there to, 1952, so he went from there down to Montgomery, Alabama, where he was at the Alabama Journal. Is that right? I think so.
Yeah, it would be.
It was the afternoon paper. There was an afternoon paper and a morning paper. And so there had, in 1956, there had been 3 instances of people who sat in front of the bus and refused to give up their seat.
This is pre-Rosa Parks.
It's pre-Rosa Parks, the same year. And they were either kicked off, they were either arrested, but nobody covered it in the news. And so what happened was it was like a Thursday that Rosa refused to give up her seat, and she was arrested. And then the Friday paper, the morning paper, Friday, carried page 9, 3 little sentences about Rosa Parks.
Right.
But that Friday night, my dad got wind of these people from Knoxville, from a place called the Highlander Center. And maybe it wasn't Knoxville then, it was up around Swanee at that time. A guy named Miles Horton and some other folks from Highlander Center with a mimeograph machine that you hand cranked and made these flyers. They took out like 1,000 flyers in the African American neighborhood that said, we're going to have a bus boycott. My dad got one of those flyers. So he goes in Saturday. He's 26-year-old crime beat reporter, and he waited until the editors and everybody in the press room left. I mean, just immediately left. And then Dad calls down to the press room, that infamous word, stop the presses, and he redummies the front page.
Wow, what
And
an act of rebellion there.
he redummied it, and he wrote the story about Rosa Parks and made it a front page story this long. And that was the story that got under Reuters, AP, UPI, Associated Press, United Press International, and Reuters.
So that's how the world really learned.
That's how the world learned about Rosa Parks.
And did he get fired for that?
Later.
Later.
he got fired. He wrote a story on abortion, and it won a statewide UPI or a state award, but he got fired over that one. He got fired at 3 different newspapers for his reporting, his independent reporting. But then, and it coincidentally, every time Mom had a kid, Dad would somehow wind up getting fired.
Uh-oh.
And I was the 4th one that he got fired, and then he went to the Tennessean. John Sigenthaler, who had been on the Freedom Rides, got beat up. That's who Dad went and worked for, and so amazingly he was able to work for him for 32 years before getting fired.
Those who don't know, John Siegenthaler was a very famous journalist. His son became a journalist for NBC News.
That's right.
John Siegenthaler actually has a bridge named after him in Nashville because it's the same bridge he talked a guy off of committing suicide on. He's a fascinating fellow. He started a Freedom of the Press Center there.
Right, the First Amendment Center at
Died
Vanderbilt.
less than 10 years ago. I remember when he died, I was very sad because I had met him, and I believe he had also been, before he come back to Tennessee, had been a political aide to Bobby Kennedy.
Right, that's correct too.
So it's a big name in journalism that he was working with John Siegenthaler.
Right.
Yeah. So while he was at the Tennessean, he also had the opportunity to do some civil rights stories, right?
My dad, yes, a whole lot. But he did it in the guise of, he had a Sunday book column. So he started in the linotype. He was composition editor. Do you know what that is?
I do, they may not know.
Okay, so back in the old days, I'm going to tell you about newspapers. Okay, back in the old days, they had this thing called linotype, so hot lead. They had deaf guys, they had like 75 deaf men, there were no women, in this room that was monstrously loud. It was like working inside of a jet engine, and they were all deaf. And so what they would do is they would sit and they would type. The copy would come up, and
Yeah.
am I getting into much detail?
Well, I'll just say that lead was created for each individual letter sometimes.
That's right.
Occasionally words like the, I don't think they had presets. But it took forever. Well, it didn't take forever. It took a long time. That's why it took a lot of people to make these racks of letters and things that would make up a news page.
Right, linotype. Linotype means a line of type. although it's spelled, I think, Lineotype, something like that.
Yeah.
So linotype, that's what my dad's first job at the Tennessean, Nashville Tennessean, was work up there in that noise, and that's why he became deaf.
Oh dear.
But anyway, but as he worked his way up in the newspaper, he became the youngest news editor in the Tennessean history. He worked his way up pretty quickly.
His name was Bunny Dolph Honicker.
Right, Bunny Dolph Honicker.
Sometimes BD, I see.
B.D. Honicker, yeah.
Yeah. So he had this review of books where we would frequently look at books by black authors and books about the civil rights movement. Was
Right.
this his intent, or just did he want to sort of push the issue a bit? What was going on?
Well, I would invite all of you to go take a trip down to the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery. And as you walk into the Rosa Parks Museum, the very first thing you see is this 4-foot by 8-foot news article of the bombing of Martin Luther King's house. And that was written by my dad. And so it turned out Dad, Mom, and the kids, I wasn't around yet, lived maybe 3 blocks from King's house. And when Dad was getting ready for work, it was early afternoon, he hears an explosion, he throws on his minimal amount of clothes, runs barefoot up to King's house, and sees what's happened. And about that time, the police pull up. My dad's, of course, the crime beat reporter, and they say, "Scribe, go on home. There's gonna be violence here. No place for a white man." And then about that time, Martin Luther King pulls up and runs in the house and goes and checks on Coretta and the kids. And then he comes back out and he says to the crowd, he says, "Everybody, Coretta is okay, the kids are okay, and I'm okay." He said, "We don't meet violence with violence. Y'all go on home." And so what could have been a real angry, justifiably so angry crowd, they dispersed. But my dad stayed around and interviewed everybody that he could and got as many leads as he could on who these people were who bombed his house, and wrote that story in the last sentence of the story, very rich with detail on who, what, when, where, how, and why. The last sentence of the story is, "The police have no leads." Or my dad had like 30 leads. So anyway, he became personal friends with Martin Luther King. And he would go around the state driving to these various events with King. And they became friends. And King would visit my dad and John Siegenthaler when he was in Nashville.
I want to ask members of that group now. I know there are at least 2 of you here, some more have come in. You have questions?
You said he got fired from 3 different newspapers for independent reporting.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what those stories were on? Was it?
He did a story on back alley abortions that won a state award at one of the newspapers. I think in Panama City he did one on death and cemeteries and the whole scam of overcharging for caskets and whatnot. And then in Mobile, Alabama, when I was born, he got fired because the editor was a Catholic and got wind of that dad in a Catholic hospital had a vasectomy because he had 4 kids in 6 years. And so that one wasn't really on reporting, that was just on birth control, I guess.
Okay.
Kind of personal.
Yeah. Any other questions from that group?
But that group, you guys working on that, my dad had a column in the Tennessean called the Minority Report. And in the Minority Report, he asked the book review editor, a woman by the name of Floyd Beatty, to get him all the books on the civil rights that were coming out, that he wanted to review those. So he would review those books in the newspaper. They came out Sunday. And then he would subtly interject his own opinion in these book review columns.
One thing I don't think I ever asked you, do you know the Reverend Harold Middlebrook?
And you had mentioned that name, and I remembered it in context to a fellow named Harry Wurzma, who I think was involved in the sit-ins.
Harry was involved in sit-ins and things like that, but
Yeah.
the Rev was one of MLK's youth leaders. He
Yeah.
lives here now, he's 80-something, and they'll be hearing from him as well.
Oh,
Civil rights story.
I would love to have a sit down with you and he, and maybe put a Zoom on, like my mother, who's in her 90s now. Let her be in on that
Maybe
phone
we
call.
can put a Zoom together with all of you.
That would be great.
That would be fun if we could put that together. That would certainly help that group. Maybe that's how I'll handle it. Do a Zoom and get your mom in on the call.
Yes, that would be terrific.
Because mom is what, 90-something, 95?
She's just turned 90 this year.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
yeah, we've got to get her talking about this too, because this is.
Yeah, well, the irony of all this is I didn't even know this. I mean, I knew Dad was very deep in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War,
Yeah.
and detested Richard Nixon, but I didn't know the family connection until the weekend he died, and then my mom told me about it, and so yeah, I drove. We were in LaGrange, Georgia. I drove the 45 minutes down to Montgomery, and looked at the newspapers and saw, yeah, he the year that he stayed there, he covered the civil rights issue almost every day in the newspaper.
And that was difficult and rare, because I imagine the majority white-owned newspapers downplayed the black community to an incredible degree. They were probably nearly invisible. Is that a fair summary?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there wouldn't be stories about prominent black deaths or marriage notices or almost anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
great.
your father doing civil rights stories probably pushed the limits of some of those old white guys in the newsroom.
Well, I mean, even to the extent of John Siegenthaler, who was one of the most liberal white men you could possibly meet, sent my dad home 3 times. Mom didn't know he was going to be fired yet again, because my dad was always pushing the envelope.
Other questions from that group? No? So I'm going to ask questions. You know I'm going to ask questions. I want you guys. All right. So let's turn back to the radiation issues for a second.
Okay.
Okay. What do you think is the bigger danger, if you will, the one that has injured the most people most likely? The nuclear energy industry or the atomic bomb making?
Boy, it's a good question, and I'm neither an epidemiologist nor a radiation health physicist, so I wouldn't throw numbers on that. For me, coming from a journalism family, and for me, the only thing I have in common with Donald Trump is that we were both born on Flag Day, June 14th. So I'm very.
Okay, it's my wedding anniversary too, by the way.
Congratulations.
Yes?
I'm very, very attached to this thing called the U.S. Constitution, and our nuclear weapons program and our nuclear power program are not dissimilar from the movie theaters. Because when you go to the movies, you have to have this willing suspension of disbelief. You know, you go watch a movie and you see all these action characters, and they're doing all these crazy things, and you just kind of have to suspend disbelief that that's not real, and that's your entertainment. And that's kind of how the nuclear weapons program approached creating nuclear weapons in America. They had a willing suspension of constitutional rights of the people who worked in those plants, of the families who were exposed to their parents' toxins that they brought home on their clothes, to the downwinders who were exposed in the nuclear weapons test, to the atomic vets, the 300,000 atomic vets who were part of the above ground nuclear explosions. There's countless thousands of people whose basic constitutional rights were taken away from them. That's what I uncovered here at the University of Tennessee, and that's what I dogged for over 15 years to try to get some accountability. And we're still not there.
Do you have allies like the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, the Atomic Trade Workers? Are they usual allies?
Well, AREPA was focused on strictly on marching and peace and working outside of the walls. My wife, who is an attorney, who worked with me on this, we took a different approach, and we worked inside the walls. We worked with individual nuclear workers. We worked with affected nuclear workers. Jackie represented the very, very first environmental whistleblower case brought at Oak Ridge.
Jackie's your wife.
Jackie Kittrell, my wife, yeah. And she is also a graduate of University of Tennessee Law School, and is prior to us even meeting, she was working on this with the ATLC, Atomic Trades Labor Council, and other facilities around the country. So yeah, we were nuclear made match.
Okay. That said, I think as journalists, we're kind of interested in some of the tools things. So have you ever had to use the Freedom of Information Act or an Open Meetings Act request or an Open Records Act request in your goals and tasks?
Yes, but I went more to the core, and like I said, in April 1984, I initiated a congressional investigation because I knew that a lot of the material that I was going after would be exempted through privacy issues on
And
FOIA
blacked out and you got
and redacted or simply not provided. So I wanted the power of Congress to walk in and say, let's go into those vaults. So I have been in actual vaults, the Department of Energy, touring. They wouldn't let me
Yeah.
rifle, but yeah, read the article and you'll see how they, even with the imprimatur of a congressional investigation, they still withheld information.
Anything from anyone on either of the subjects that the groups are working on? Okay. Well, then I want to thank Cliff Honicker for being here today and for giving us, now what I've done here is I've videotaped and recorded the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'll probably break it into parts and make it available on the class website. Maybe it's like a private YouTube video they can have access to. Does
And
that
I would
work for
like
you?
to also extend for your class, if you would like to have the better half come and make more detailed
You're talking about
explanation.
Jackie
My wife,
Kittrell.
Jackie Kittrell, has volunteered to come and speak to you about the, she did the work, the daily boots on the ground work with the nuclear workers, and she's a lot better describing it than myself.
Well, I think it's time for a family and friends Zoom call. So we're going to get you, your wife, your mom, and maybe Harold Middlebrook and do a Zoom call. Does that sound like a plan?
I think that'd be fantastic.
That'd be fun. So what I'll do is I will go through all the efforts of establishing that. We'll do it probably within about a week, if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I may need to juggle your schedule a little bit to make that happen, but it's going to happen. So thank
Okay.
you again.
Yeah.
Cliff?
My pleasure.
Student?